Hey guys, welcome back. Today we're checking out the Echo One P9. This is the pistol-caliber-carbine version of the Echo One P15, essentially its sister AEG. In both the firearm world and the airsoft world, the pistol caliber carbine, essentially a rifle with a pistol caliber, has been kind of taking off. It's becoming a thing, and Echo One has definitely jumped on that bandwagon. This is extremely similar to the Echo One P15, both internally and externally, but of course it has a different lower receiver and takes a different 9mm mag. Before we dive into the AEG, let's check out everything it comes with really quickly. The Echo One P9 is pretty minimalistic and doesn't come with a whole lot. First of all, it'll come with a mid-capacity magazine. This is based on the Classic Army X9 magazine, so there are plenty of aftermarket options out there if you want to grab more than just the included mid-capacity magazine. A decently long cleaning rod for it, a speed loader for the mid-capacity magazine, a little bag of BBs. These are more for testing just to make sure your airsoft gun works, and a Dean's to Tamiya adapter if you're still living in the past and haven't upgraded to a Dean's battery. We'll start with the stock of the airsoft gun and move our way forward. The stock is pretty minimalistic. I do like that about it. There's no bells and whistles about it. It does have an adjustment lever here, so you can slide it back or adjust it inward pretty easily. And it does have quite a few sling attachment points, 2 metal inserts for quick detach sling points on either side. So you have plenty of options. And just in front of that too, on the back of the saber, is a metal sling plate with a loop on either side. So if you want to attach a sling to this gun, you've got a ridiculous number of ways to do it. Something I was surprised about when I got this AEG in is this pin right here, which acts as the fulcrum for the adjustment lever here, was actually floating around the box. It's pretty loose in there, and I can easily push it to either side with just a really light tap. So I would imagine maybe in the future a knurled pin might be the best option, but in the meantime, maybe putting a dab of super glue on either end to keep it in place would probably be the best fix. Battery installation is very simple. There is a tab on either side of the stock. Simply pull those all the way down and your stock will slide right off. It is a buffer tube battery compartment, so you've got a Dean's connector here with some thinner wiring, and there is no MOSFET in the buffer tube. It's strictly in the gearbox, so you've got a ton of space inside of the stock to install your battery. This is a 1200 milliamp hour Titan lithium polymer battery. It's 25C, and it fits all the way into the stock with about a ½ inch of clearance in the end for your wiring and your connector. The receiver on this airsoft gun is polymer, and it has a pretty unique lower receiver. The upper receiver is your pretty standard M4-esque receiver, and the P15 upper receiver I believe will actually fit just fine on it. So if you wanted the shorter receiver and you had both airsoft guns by chance, like I did for a review, you could swap them and actually have a shorter version of this for pistol caliber carbine, which I think would be the way to go. The selector is a little bit different. It is pinned into a cam inside of the receiver, which is just a smidge different from most AEGs, but it is different from the P15, which has an ambi selector. So you go to the 9mm and you get a left side only selector. The charging handle is a dual side lever charging handle, which I think is really neat. Something a lot of firearms have been going with lately. It's been very popular, and to see it carried over to an airsoft gun out of the box I think is a nice touch. Pulling the charging handle back will reveal your hop-up adjustment. There is no locking bolt catch, so you'll have to pull this back while you're adjusting it. It is a rotary style hop-up, and it has a really nice click when you rotate the drum. What I found really interesting actually about the lower receiver is you get a ton of finger room here. You've got a flat face trigger, which is a really nice upgrade, and you've got a lot of room here for almost gloves if you want potentially, but there's a plastic fin here on the back side of the magazine well, and I feel like if they wanted to get rid of that, it would almost be comfortable to hold this like a P90. And really you could take like a metal file or another cutting device and get rid of that pretty easily. I don't think it would compromise the integrity of the lower receiver at all. It's pretty sturdy as it is. So I'm curious why they put the plastic fin here. I think it'd work better if it wasn't there. The rail system on the front end is pretty short. It is all polymer, but it doesn't creak or wobble or anything like that. So it is very well affixed to the upper receiver. The sights, the front and rear, are extremely basic. They are not spring-loaded or anything like that, so you simply move them up and down, and they have a little bit of a detent to them. The rear sight is adjustable for strictly windage and has 2 peep apertures on it, but this one was a little bit loose. It's almost, if you're running around, it might flop between one or the other, which I found a little bit interesting. And the front one is adjustable for elevation. When the sights are flipped down, there's a notch in the front and the back you can line up, kind of a backup sighting system, I suppose, but they're so low that you can't physically get your eye line low enough to use them, especially with goggles or glasses. They're pretty unusable. So the sights really need to be used flipped up. At the front of the gun is a roughly 1-inch long birdcage-esque flash hider. It is plastic, but underneath is a 14mm negative thread. So if you want to replace this with something metal or your favorite suppressor or tracer, you have the option to do that. To program your airsoft gun, you want to put it in semi, and you'll want to make sure it's clear because it's going to fire one shot. So you're going to pull the trigger and hold. Now you're in programming mode. The first option is semi, second option is full auto, the third option is pre-cocking. So I'm going to go to semi. And we have two options. The first is semi and the second is binary. So I'm going to select the second one. And now we have our functionality inputted. So if I pull the trigger, I get a shot. Now if I let off, I get a shot. So we've successfully set up the binary mode. And for every option, you'll have to go back into programming and program it. So if I want to go back in, I'll hold. And then I'll go to full auto, and hold. First option is full auto, and the second one is 3-round burst. So we've successfully programmed 3-round burst. So I'll put it on auto. It's not always a perfect 3-round burst. Sometimes you get 2 shots, but most of the time you get a nice 3-round burst. The third option is pre-cocking, and you've got a number of options there. Essentially what that is after every shot, it'll cock the piston back a little bit, so your follow-up shot will be a little bit faster. I'm not going to demo that here because it can take a little bit of fine-tuning to get correct. For this review on all the testing, I did use a Titan 11.1 volt, 1200 milliamp hour 25C battery. These are fantastic and fit very nicely in the buffer tube, and if you want, there's an affiliate link in the description of this video. Grab one there and it helps me out just a little bit. Now with the Echo One P9 apart, we can check out the hop-up and barrel, motor, and the whole gearbox assembly. The long type motor does use a D-type pinion and has a pretty decent amount of torque. It's definitely above average as far as torque goes on typical airsoft guns. So if you wanted to use a field spring instead of the included M100-ish spring, you could drop it in and not have a problem. The included barrel is a 280mm brass 6.02 bore barrel, so it's a little tighter bore than usual. The polymer M4 style hop-up is a rotary style hop, and the drum for the hop-up has a really nice tactile click every time you rotate it. And it's quite audible as well. This gun has a quick change spring gearbox. The spring guide is polymer but with a metal base. The spring is a non-linear, irregular pitch-esque spring. It has tighter portions on 3 spots, which is a little bit unusual. Normally your irregular pitch springs are only on 2 portions where they're tighter. Let's go ahead and dig into the gearbox here. There's a fair amount to look at. I'm going to pop the shims off of the bushings there and put them back on the gears so that I can retain my shimming and don't mess it up. The gearbox shell is pretty hefty. The front is fairly radius. The top there is properly done. The bottom I think could use a little bit of refinement. It's not quite perfect. It does use 8mm solid steel bushings instead of bearings of any kind. These in general tend to be more durable and last longer, especially with your higher FPS guns. So I'd take these over bearings if I had to pick one or the other. The compression system, let's look at this, uses a pretty typical M4 port cylinder there. So the shorter barrel, being about 280 mil, is about roughly 80mm shorter than a typical M4 barrel. Fairly flexible tappet plate. You'll notice the fin is fairly long on it as well. Polymer nozzle with an O-ring in there. And it sits reasonably tight on the nozzle stem itself, so it gets a good seal. The seal, as far as the entire piston assembly, is actually really good. Not getting much leakage. Definitely a little bit once it starts to hit the port there, but not a whole lot. So it's actually a really quite good seal. The piston is a steel tooth rack. Has the second to last tooth somewhat shaved down. It's not totally, so that's a plus, but I think if you wanted to totally get rid of that and about half of that third to last tooth, that's the way to go. Then you can correct AOE after that. Pretty typical piston head, 4 ports there, nothing too crazy. Speed cuts on the piston rails as well. The cylinder head is also pretty average, single O-ring and rubber damper on there. The gears are steel, pretty typical. Has a sector delayer on the sector, which is great. Can't help with feeding at higher rates of fire, and I just like to put them on pretty much any airsoft gun I have in general. The MOSFET looks moderately familiar. I feel like I've seen similar designs out there. It is a mechanical MOSFET as far as when it can detect when the cam rotation is correct on the sector gear. There's a little micro switch there and a small micro switch on the opposite side for the selector as well. Let's go ahead and check the shimming. The sector gear could probably use a smidge of refinement. It's really not bad, but stock shimming, I'll give it a pass. But if I'm gonna like perfect this, yeah, it needs a little bit of refinement there. The spur gear seems to be dead on. Not getting any movement out of it. And the bevel gear, it's about the same amount of movement as the sector. Could use a little refinement, but for a stock airsoft gun, gets a pass. The gears spin pretty well, although they can make a little bit of a sliding noise when rotated at various angles, which, you know, pros and cons. It's fine, they'll last just as long, but I tend to make things try and sound as decent as possible when spinning these, when the gearbox is rotated at any angle. This is how I was essentially taught to shim years and years and years ago. The height between all the gears is also pretty good. There could still be a little bit of refinement, as aforementioned, with the small amount of play with the sector and bevel gear here, but overall, it's a pretty good shim job. I'm going to give it a B+, A-, somewhere in there. Could use a small number of tweaks, but overall, it's actually pretty good for a stock airsoft gun. The Echo 1 P9 is an interesting airsoft gun. I tried it out at Nighthawk Airsoft, and the range and accuracy I felt were fairly average. At about 150 feet or so, you could hit a man-sized target reasonably consistently, but the groupings had opened up to about the size of a person. So you could hit them, but it'd kind of just be anywhere on the player. The range being about 150 to 175 feet at the most, I felt was pretty average. And I did test both .25 and .32 gram BBs in this gun. 2.5s I felt actually performed a little bit better. They flew a little bit farther and actually had slightly better groupings, which was very odd. The 3.2s, they didn't fly quite as far. I feel like this didn't quite have the power or the air volume to push those heavier BBs out that far. The rate of fire and trigger response were excellent out of the box. I ran a Titan 11.1 volt 1200 milliamp hour lithium polymer battery in this gun, which fit really well in the stock, and it was fantastic. Very, very quick trigger response and about 20 rounds a second on full auto, which is great. Very little gear noise and sounded really crisp. The Echo 1 P9 chronoed in at about 365 FPS, give or take, with a 2. I chronoed it in the beginning of the video with a .25, so you had about 45 FPS per that 0.05 difference, and you get about the speed right there. So it kind of sits in the mid to lower end of the field FPS range. This feels like more of a CQB airsoft gun to me, and I'll explain a little bit of that here in a moment too. So I bet you if you ran about 1,000 BBs through this gun, the spring would probably lighten up and get right around to that like 350 FPS mark, which would be perfect for indoors. If you want to run it even softer, this does have the quick change spring system, so you can drop an M90 spring in there and easily get about 1 joule roughly. If you watched my Echo 1 P15 review, you'd know about the MOSFET inside this gun and the timer it has. Essentially what happens is when you plug this airsoft gun into a battery, you have a 10-minute window every time you pull the trigger. So if you don't fire for 10 minutes, it shuts the airsoft gun off, and the only way to resuscitate it is to unplug the battery and plug it back in. For longer games, several hours, you're out on the field for a while, or things like Milsim West, where you're out there for a better part of 2 days roughly, I'm not sure this is the right airsoft gun for you. There are times where you're gonna be out there doing nothing for a long, long time, and you'll wanna have your airsoft gun ready to go in a snap. And if you have to unplug your battery and plug it back in to get it working in a firefight, it's probably not the best option. But for indoor fields where there's a lot of action really quickly, you're gonna have only like a few seconds between engagements, if that. You can run back and forth, there's no issues. This is the perfect option. It's lightweight, extremely snappy, very good internals, and very consistent FPS from what I saw, within a few FPS per shot. And the 10-minute timer more or less will not be applicable. So I feel like this airsoft gun definitely has its roles. The field is probably not the best option for it, but indoor and faster paced games where time doesn't matter, this is an excellent airsoft gun and has a lot of upgrade potential if you want to take it even farther than it's already come out of the box. I'm going to give this airsoft gun a 7 out of 10. It would be an excellent 10 out of 10 if it weren't for the MOSFET timer, but just because of that, I got to ding it down a little bit. So I'm hoping in the future Echo One will fix that to where there is no timer and you can just run it all day without a problem. But it is kind of the one caveat I feel like when you buy this airsoft gun, you need to be aware of that. If you wanted to, you can still grab this and throw in an aftermarket MOSFET such as a Perun Hybrid or a Gate Titan or Aster. There are definitely options out there that would negate the 10-minute internal timer. A big thank you to Jag and Echo One for sending this out. It's really appreciated and always fun to check out new AEGs from you guys. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next review.